Okay, welcome to Lesson 7, which I call Escalation, which looks at anti-Semitism in Germany from 1936 up to the start of the war in 1939. Now, we can't help but start in 1936 with the 1936 Olympic Games. You may or may not be aware, but probably are aware that Germany hosted the Summer Games. Well, they also hosted the Winter Games, and that's an often overlooked fact. All that said, the Games, according to Hitler, were not to be distracted by anti-Semitism, and he did not want countries, more particularly America, being given an excuse to withdraw from these games, which were supposed to highlight the rebirth of Germany, and therefore anti-Semitism was sort of put in the back burner. And what you get in 1936 is a period of calm. Many people began to really hope and believe that the Nuremberg laws were indeed the final solution to the quote-unquote Jewish problem in Germany. Immigration out of Germany slowed, and many Germans, in fact, who left very sadly and ominously returned. Harassment, however, didn't stop. Many leading Nazis, like Streicher, of course, will be angered by this 1936 period of calm and demand more and more action. In fact, in 1936, at the party conference in Nuremberg, Streicher says that the Nazis have declared war on the Jews, which would end up in their annihilation. Very prophetic statement. That said, Goebbels' propaganda, as seen from the picture on the right, which is a poster for the called The Eternal Jew, which becomes a title of a propaganda movie against the Jews, starts to assimilate Jews, or rather not assimilate, associate Jews with the Jews of Eastern Europe, the Ostjuden, the Hasidic Jews and so on and so forth, who actually weren't common in Germany. In fact, most Jews in Germany were almost entirely assimilated and couldn't be distinguished in any way, shape, or form from the average German walking up and down the street. What really sort of takes the period of calm and escalates it into a very dangerous new form is the impact of the SS and their control of the Jewish question. By 1937, the SS is becoming a very powerful organization within the party and the state. They were concerned with the clear criteria, and they wanted a professional system for finding a solution to the Jewish question. The SD, a group of the SS, known as the intelligence agency of the SS, oftentimes the SD and the Gestapo are mixed up. You have to look at the Gestapo as being tasked with rooting out both internal and external enemies. The SD is particularly an intelligence agency for ensuring that all Germans fall in line, so they're focusing on the internal workings of Germany and making sure that everything is in line with what the party wants to do, and that does mean root out people who aren't necessarily German. So you can see in many ways how the Jews who are considered non-Germans would fall under the grip of the SD. The SD in itself is established as a division for Jewish affairs, and this is given to a keen Austrian Nazi, a man by the name of Adolf Eichmann, who will earn, of course, fame both during the war in Auschwitz, but also after the war for his famous trial in Jerusalem. He believes that the ideal solution in 1936 is the mass immigration of Jews, but he faced a lot of obstacles to this, and tasked with running and finding a solution to the Jewish question was quite difficult. In fact, one of the interesting things is that the SD tries to force people to immigrate. Other departments actually limit Jews' ability to obtain passports, and this is very indicative of the whole confusion and chaos of the Nazi system. So you have these party groups or these organizations created to deal with the matters of the here and now, who run headlong into the work of other organizations and then sometimes doing contradictory things, hence this wonderful example. But the impact of the SS is actually relatively important, as it will increase both the nature and the, I hesitate to use the term professionalism, but the efficiency, if you will, of the way the Jewish question is handled from this point on forward. So, but 1937, after the Olympics are done and behind Germany, there really is a year of escalating tensions over the Jewish question. There are really three reasons for this. Number one, Germany is in an incredibly strong position economically. It had reached zero unemployment. It had begun to rearm. There had been little difficulty with that rearmament and the reoccupation of the Rhineland internationally. Therefore, Hitler feared much less the reaction of the international community, and therefore their response to anti-Semitism was much less of a concern to him. The second was the fact that by 1937, with that stronger position, Hitler starts to move to replace state institutions who he had basically kept from 1933 forward, and basically get rid of them and the conservative elites who were influential in government and replace them with party people. One of the most notable to go, of course, was Hjalmar Schacht, who, as we learned last lesson, spoke out against anti-Jewish legislation on the grounds of economic reasons. This really the dismissal of Schacht and, of course, the dismissal of other conservative elites in the administration, in the army, in the diplomatic corps, really ends the influence the old elites of the Weimar era and even before it had, and particularly the influence they had had on moderating Nazi policy from 1933 to 1936. And also, with them being removed, you see the removal of a key barrier protecting the Jews. And lastly, Hermann Göring. Göring is a leading Nazi. He had been with Hitler since the very beginning. He was a revolutionary. He was wounded in the beer hall putsch. He is placed in charge of the economics ministry, which is then integrated into his office of the four-year plan. So his sort of takeover of the economics ministry will have very, I suppose, disastrous effects for the Jews. Now, from this point basically forward, he becomes, in large ways, responsible for dealing with the Jewish question. As a Nazi, his approach will be much, much more hard than that of Schacht. Now, a couple interesting points about Göring. He had the objective to secretly prepare for war, and as such, he basically had carte blanche to do whatever needed to be done. He would push Jewish firms to sell to German firms for rock bottom prices on the cheap for the quote-unquote benefit of these companies, so that these firms would benefit from the process of Aryanization. And what he does in 1938 is he issues a decree known as the Decree for the Registration of Jewish Property. And this says that Jews with property worth more than 5,000 marks had to register for the government, and that way he would have a good idea of what valuable Jewish property and businesses there were, which would then pave the way, of course, for the confiscation of all Jewish property later on. Other decrees issued by him would remove the Jews from the economic life of Germany bit by bit by bit. In April 1938, attacks 40,000 businesses owned by Jews. And by the end of that year, by 1939, only 20% of these avoided Aryanization in any way. 1938 saw a real encouragement for Jews to leave Germany. Hitler decrees in 1938 that he favored immigration by every possible means. This meant that party radicals mounted more and more anti-Semitic campaigns with sort of the blessing of the Fuhrer. Anyone with a criminal record, particularly in Berlin, where Goebbels was put in charge of sort of finding every possible means, rounds up people. People with parking fines as a version of criminal record are included in this, and thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews are sent to concentration camps at this point for even the most simple, tiny crime. So yeah, what we see, I guess, is this increased anti-Semitic campaign, people getting taken away. But by July 1938, you actually start to see some of the more horrible policies come into play. Not that any of it, of course, wasn't any less horrible than the rest, but we start to see a massive escalation here. The Interior Ministry, led by Frick, will decree in 1938, July, that by January of 1939, all male Jews must assume the name Israel, while females must take the name Sarah. And this would be both in their address formally in person. They would be expected to address themselves as Israel, and then also in official documents. And this would be mandatory for all Jews living in Germany, as they sort of a way of humiliating them even further. The Anschluss with Austria really leads to a hardening of anti-Semitic activity, and I suppose in many ways this is linked to and accelerated by the events surrounding Nazis' unification and breaking of the Treaty of Versailles and their Anschluss with Austria. During Anschluss, Austrian Nazis basically welcome the union with Germany with euphoria, and use this euphoria to basically unleash a wave of spontaneous violence against approximately, there are about 190,000 Jews in Austria. Many of these people are beaten up, forced to wash the streets and pavements in front of jeering crowds. Others had their homes and businesses looted. Thousands and thousands were arrested. Meanwhile, I suppose, the SD under Eichmann sets up a central office for Jewish immigration in Vienna. Eichmann is actually very efficient, and he was quick in sort of forcibly immigrating 50,000 Jews. He cuts through in Austria a lot of the red tape and a lot of the issues because he doesn't have the hang-ups and the need to get the Führer's permission, which slow things up. In Germany, he basically takes over and he forcibly immigrates 50,000 Jews, as opposed to only 19,000 who were immigrated in 1938 in Germany. So Eichmann moves very fast and efficiently. But what's interesting here, and we need to remember, is the fact that even though 50,000 Austrian Jews were kicked out and 19,000 Germans left in 1938 alone, that didn't mean that these people were accepted. Some of the really sad stories of ships full of Jewish refugees going port to port, hoping for asylum and being turned away, Britain, Canada, America, the SS St. Louis is the one famous story, really originate from these emigrations organized by Adolf Eichmann. In the Sudetenland, that area of Czech Republic that was, let's say, annexed or quote-unquote given to the Germans following the Munich Conference of 1938, the situation for the Sudeten Jews wasn't very good at all, and I think this speaks to the broader European anti-Semitism. The Jews in the Sudetenland were deported, basically, and they were told that they needed to leave and report and move to what remained of Czechoslovakia. But of course, the Czech authorities wouldn't let these people through. They didn't accept them, even though these people had technically been Czech nationals only a month before. So after living literally on the borderlands, living outside, eventually other countries across Europe sort of took pity on them and started to take them in. Many of these people immigrated to Hungary. Polish Jews faced also a very uncertain future. There were quite a few Polish Jews living in Germany at the time, and the Poles actually revoked their citizenship for fear of the fact that Germany would basically deport these people back to Poland, who, quote, I suppose, didn't want them. However, when the Germans rounded them up and shipped them to Poland, the government said no, but under massive pressure, not only from Hitler, but from the other leading Nazis in the foreign ministry, the Polish government collapsed, and they took what Hitler referred to as his undesirables. This all leads to probably the biggest escalation in anti-Jewish policy, which is the situation around Kristallnacht. On the 7th of November 1938, Ernst von Rath, he was a German embassy official in Paris, was shot by a 17-year-old Polish Jew. And he did this out of, sort of in response to the mistreatment of his parents and the thousands of other Polish Jews in Germany. Goebbels seized on this to get back in Hitler's good books. He had a scandalous affair with a Czech actress, which had upset Hitler greatly. Not that, necessarily Hitler was against infidelity, but he was particularly fond of Goebbels' wife, Magda Goebbels, who he held up personally as the ideal Aryan German woman. And because influence and being close to the Führer was so important in getting things done, being influential in this, Goebbels losing favor was terribly bad for his career. So he seizes on this opportunity of Ernst von Rath to basically start a very, I don't know how to say this, indignant press campaign against the Jews between the 8th and 9th of November 1938. He basically wants to stir up trouble, and what this leads to is, again, a spontaneous popular movement. On their own initiative, Nazi gangs attack Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues, and they do this without specific orders from above. A few days later, after his wounds refused to heal, Rath died. And it happened that he died around, I suppose, on the 9th of November in the evening. And when Hitler was informed of this, he was actually at what was called the Old Fighters' Dinner. And every year the Nazis would go on 9th of November to the Munich town hall to celebrate the beer hall putsch and the fair beer hall putsch. So all of the Nazis would have this big party and celebration. And in fact, it was something that was celebrated all over Germany, but the Nazis would meet in Munich where it happened to commemorate the 1923 putsch. An intense conversation takes place between Hitler and Goebbels, who is seated next to him. Hitler leaves soon afterwards without giving his usual speech, which he always does at this particular point. And Goebbels gets up and speaks instead. And during this speech, he delivers a bitter attack on the Jews. He calls for Rath's death to be avenged. He makes it very clear that Hitler would not oppose spontaneous demonstrations of the type that had already occurred. And he left senior Nazis in absolutely no doubt whatsoever what was expected of them. So after he's finished speaking, these party leaders immediately set about going and giving their instructions to their various subordinates via the telephone. It's also interesting to note that Himmler wasn't present at this dinner, therefore he didn't hear Goebbels' speech, and basically the SS is left out of Kristallnacht. And what would have happened had they been involved is, I suppose, one of those other interesting questions. Now, what does happen is that the violence in the night of the 10th of November, the night of, gets known as the night of the broken glass, Kristallnacht. In total, you have 100 deaths, 200 synagogues burned. These are approximate 10,000 businesses attacked, 20,000 people sent to concentration camps. Hitler's actually quite surprised at the extent of this pogrom. Göring, like many Germans, is horrified by the damage to property and the potential economic effects of all of this. Himmler is quite critical about the undisciplined behavior of the SA people who acted spontaneously during Kristallnacht. But what we see here is very important to note that most and very few ordinary Germans speak out against it. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that large numbers of Germans were not opposed to the maltreatment of Jews at this particular point. Additionally, Catholic and Protestant bishops, even though they could have, did not speak out and condemn Kristallnacht either. So what the pogrom really indicates here is that some Germans were actually delighted to kill the Jews. What this all leads to is a meeting of the top Nazis. On the 12th of November, Göring will chair an important interministerial meeting to determine the implications of what happens, or what happened at Kristallnacht. And they wanted to basically plan the future of Jewish policy. At this meeting, Göring, of course, Goebbels, Heydrich, the heads of the economic, finance, and foreign ministry, and heads of insurance companies. These people basically are all there. And what they decide are that the reaction to Kristallnacht will be swift and would further enforce the anti-Semitic laws and that rather further escalate them. Now, all things considered, this is a pogrom against the Jews, and in the end, they decide that the Jews are to be blamed for Kristallnacht, and that the insurance money that was meant to go to the Jews to help them rebuild their property, the insurance money that was legally entitled to them because they bought the insurance policies, would go to the government instead. The Jewish community, in addition, was fined 100 million marks as compensation for the murder of von Rath. And what you get at the end of this is a decree excluding Jews from German economic life, which will mean the total and complete Aryanization of all Jewish businesses. The exemptions of the previous year would no longer be exempt, all Jewish businesses, and this effectively removes Jews from all professional activity that involves contact with the Aryan world. The result of Kristallnacht is, in fact, segregation. Himmler will issue several more decrees banning Jews from theaters, cinemas, concerts, exhibition, cabarets, and circuses. But Hitler, of course, steps in at one point, and he rejects the most radical proposal, interestingly enough, which at this point prevents Jews from wearing the yellow star. By the winter of 1938-39, more laws will appear. Jews are driven entirely from German schools and universities. Jews are forced to hand over their driving license. Jews are not allowed to use public sports grounds or pools, and oddly enough, Jews are not even allowed to carry or allowed to own homing pigeons. Immigration increases in 1938-39. In fact, by January 1939, Göring will commission Heydrich to bring the Jewish question to a favorable solution as circumstances permit. And Heydrich will copy Eichmann's influence in what he had done in Vienna and establish a central office for Jewish immigration, just like Eichmann had done in Vienna. And his sort of ability to be as effective as Eichmann faced many problems. The fact that, in Germany by 1938-39, we're talking winter 1938-39, most of the Jews who remained were elderly. the rest were unskilled. And countries, when they open their borders to immigration, tend to look for the young, the fit, because they don't have to pay for their medical care, and also too for the skilled, so that they can be positive contributors to the economic life of that country. Some countries that didn't want the Jews dumped on them, tightened their immigration policy. Britain, faced with heightened hostility between Jews and Palestinians, also tried to limit and did limit Jewish immigration to Palestine. Overall, though, I suppose in a sense you can say that this immigration policy was quite successful. Quite a lot of Jews left Germany at this particular point. Most went to European countries, including Britain. Others went all over the world, North and South America, even to Africa, and many do actually get into Palestine. The success of the immigration policy is largely due to the sort of the efficiency of the SS, and also the fact that Britain and France in 1938 and 39 start to realize the extent of the harassment of the Jews and show a degree of sympathy to Germany's Jews and open their borders in good numbers to them. Though, unfortunately, many of those who end up in France will find themselves victims of the Nazis once again when France is invaded in 1940. In 1939, what we see is that also that German high-level civil servants are commissioned to hold talks with the British regarding a hope that Hitler had. Hitler had, in fact, started to muse in 1939 that perhaps if he deals with the British in a favorable way, he can, number one, establish a good relationship, hopefully avoiding a war if he does attack on the Eastern Front in Poland. Number two, he's also hopeful that the British will sort of designate some remote colony and basically make that the landing spot for the Jews. Of course, none of this is successful at all, and they get absolutely nowhere with the British on both of those grounds. And Heydrich goes on the record, as well as many of the other SS officials, for strongly pushing Jews to immigrate to Palestine. In fact, is quite helpful for those who wish to do so. So what we see in 1936 to 1939 is a massive escalation in anti-Jewish policy. We're still not at the point when Jews are being openly killed. We're not definitely at the Holocaust, and of course it's a war that will make those things possible. But what we do see is that Jews go from being put on the margins of society to being completely excluded and segregated from it, and to have no rights and almost no ability to survive in Germany. A position that is horrendous, but yet, of course, not as horrendous as what will happen to them, as we'll learn next lesson.